Is Richard Nixon one of the most misunderstood presidents in American history? A brilliant political mind who understood more that there was more to the picture than met the eye? Or was he simply just a crook, one of the most corrupt presidents in U.S. history, and one of the worst to ever grace the Oval Office? That's the question I'm going to be answering today on our live stream lecture, where we talk about history here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel in a friendly, neighborly manner. A happy Sunday to you and welcome, everyone. Thank you for all of your patience during this long and difficult, arduous time of my life. And I appreciate everybody waiting. This is not our normal timing or broadcasting. We are usually here Mondays, Fridays, and Saturdays for our Q&A at 6 p.m. Eastern, and then Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern for our live stream lecture. And today we are continuing that live stream lecture, but at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we are talking about Richard Nixon. And this is part 2 of a series we are doing about Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon, the 37th president of the United States. And last week we discussed Nixon's early life, his political career, his service in the Navy, his marriage, his daughters, his checkers speech, everything under the sun that covered Richard Nixon from 1911 when he was born in California to 1969 when he became the U.S. president in one of the most surprising political comebacks in American political history. And I'm not interacting with the chat that much here on the live stream. I can't see the chat right now, but I hope everybody's doing great and having a wonderful Sunday. I'm going to pick a nice background that's very fitting and appropriate for us. And today we're going to look at part 2 of it, Nixon's presidency and afterward. And we're going to discuss the timeline of events that led to probably the most famous scandal in all of U.S. presidential history, that being the Watergate scandal. And I will report, you will decide. I'm going to talk about what happened with Watergate. I'm going to discuss Nixon's presidential successes, his overwhelming re-election, and all the incredible things Nixon was able to accomplish in his 5 years as president that was severely hampered by his terrible mishandling of one of the worst scandals and cover-ups, the Watergate break-in. And at the end of the day, I will leave it up to you to decide what you think of Richard Nixon. Is he a misunderstood president who was one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, maybe of all presidential history, who simply just got screwed over by a system that was attempting at every interval to bring him down? Or was he simply just a corrupt politician who wanted power and control and then acted as that out in the most shady and manipulative ways perhaps ever seen in the Oval Office? There are many questions like this, but we've already talked about Richard Nixon's tricky past. Coming into the White House in 1969, Richard Nixon was not known as any saint. Nobody would have considered Richard Nixon to be one of the most noble or pure men, and questions of corruption had plagued him for years. Ever since the Checkers scandal, where Nixon supposedly had accepted campaign donations as gifts, personal gifts, including a dog named Checkers, a Cocker Spaniel, during a congressional campaign that came back to haunt him when he was Eisenhower's vice presidential selection in 1952, all the way to continual questions about the legitimacy of the 1960 election. Nixon saw himself as a victim of political corruption, of a state that was committed very much to overthrowing him and would do everything in their power to ruin his presidency and destroy his legacy. Nixon was vitriolic. Nixon was aggressive. And Nixon might have been right. Nixon believed very strongly that the 1960 election had been stolen from him by John F. Kennedy, and not just the Democratic apparatus that included stars like Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra, some of the most influential people in the entire country, but by more illicit means through Sinatra's ties to the mafia, which had ensured votes, especially in Chicago, that would allow the election in Illinois and elsewhere to tip the favor in the Democrats. So despite the fact that many people see Richard Nixon today, and probably for good reason, as a corrupt, scandalous president, the truth of the matter is that Nixon saw himself very much as a victim. This made him slightly paranoid. He became increasingly paranoid when he lost the gubernatorial race in California 2 years later and was no longer able to use the largest state in the Union as a platform for his political opining and activity. Nixon was also a Cold Warrior, a political child of a far-right movement that was devoted to thwarting communism wherever it saw it in the United States throughout its history, its society. This was part of the Cold War, and obviously the fear of communism created a level of paranoia in many people on the right wing throughout the 1940s and 50s, but Nixon had been the man who had uncovered Alger Hiss, the plans of the Rosenbergs, and others. Nixon was right in the thick of things when it came to the Cold War. He was a Cold Warrior for that very reason. However, Nixon had created but through that had come this level of paranoia, fear, and conspiracy. That, paired with the results of the 1960 election and the 1962 gubernatorial election, where Nixon believed that he was the target of everybody's hatred and fear, made Nixon bitter. It left him more antagonistic towards mainstream media, towards mainstream press, towards academia, towards politics in general, towards the insiders in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street. By the time Richard Nixon became president, surprisingly 6 years later, defeating the Democrat Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, amidst the clamor and chaos of the Vietnam War, the counterculture of the 1960s, the free speech movement, and a ton of other things, Nixon had become quite a bitter and paranoid man, despite his surprising amount of political success. It was this amount of vitriol that would characterize Nixon for, and may, if we actually look at it closely in the context of him being a Cold Warrior, the 1960 election, and his feelings of victimhood, actually help explain exactly, not justify, but explain exactly why Nixon did what he did in 1972, 1973, and 1974, starting with the break-in in the Watergate Hotel. So this video will not just cover Richard Nixon's rise and successes as president and challenges as president, like a normal video would, but it will also cover the failures of Richard Nixon personally and politically between 1972 and 1974, with particular attention to Watergate. But before I go on, please like and subscribe, become a friendly neighborhood historian. We have our in the handles right there. I'm not going to encourage anyone to become a member right now. Usually members get easy access and all sorts of wonderful bonuses, but I have been so busy with my life, I haven't been content as I usually am able. So I want you to wait, become a member when it suits you. Anything you give to this channel is helpful for and used in this channel to make this channel as good as possible. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to become a member of a channel, you can, but I would encourage you to wait until things are a little bit more stable. I'm producing more content. I finally can get out my long-form video series on the Industrial Revolution. By the way, I have long-form videos dropping every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern, so please check those out. But anyways, so yes, your support means a lot, and all the money you give to this channel is used by this channel to make this channel better for every single one of you. So I really appreciate everybody's support during this dark and trying time, and all of your understanding why we haven't been on normal broadcasting hours, why videos aren't coming out the way they normally do, and everything in between. So, let me see. I don't know my microphone. Well, I want people to become members as soon as they can, but I also want people to wait until the channel is actually producing content and getting early releases, and there's a lot more space for me to actually produce the extra content that I want to for channel members. Right now, channel members get access to some videos, some shorts, some long-form videos, some stuff, some early releases, but not much more than that because I've been so busy I haven't been able to produce content at the clip that would allow me to produce content for members only as well as for everyone else. So please check out the short videos, the long-form videos, and all of that great stuff, and consider a super chat. Anything you give to this channel helps this channel, and I really appreciate it. I hope you're having a wonderful Sunday evening or afternoon, and we are going to be talking again about Richard Nixon and his ascension to the presidency. So let's set the stage. Richard Nixon wins a close 1968 election against Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's Democratic vice president, who could never quite get out of Johnson's shadow. And now Richard Nixon is the man with the power behind the throne. Nixon has been in the White House many times. He was vice president under Eisenhower in the 50s. He saved his chance of being Eisenhower's vice president through a little bit of subterfuge and manipulation. He has seen Washington politics. He understands politics, but he hates the political game and he hates the people that he's surrounded with. He has no admiration whatsoever for Lyndon Johnson, and he has many serious questions that will continue throughout his life about exactly what happened on November 22nd, 1963, when his friend and former political foe, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas. Nixon supposedly did not believe the Warren Commission nor the official findings that said that there was a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted to kill the president because Oswald was a communist. So take with that what you will. Whatever you think about what happened to John F. Kennedy in 1963, Nixon may very well be on the more conspiratorial cutting edge of that and was there 55 years ago. Nixon had serious questions about the fate of his former friend and political rival, and had many doubts about the competency of Lyndon Johnson, who he believed was a terrible person. However, Nixon had a different agenda when he became president, restoring law and order, appealing to the silent majority, the people who hadn't been allowed. The squeakiest wheel had gotten the oil for quite some time. Young college students fighting desperately for their rights, be it free speech, civil rights, or of course against the war in Vietnam, which is the biggest draw of the time, were obviously continuing to clamor for freedom and more rights, and continuing to rail against the establishment. Nixon believed he represented not them, but their parents and others who were horrified by the unfolding narrative of a nation seemingly in social chaos amid the assassinations of such huge political figures as John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. Nixon believed it was time for the government to restore order and peace and security. This meant sending in the National Guard to college campuses to help quell rioters, protesters, and sit-ins and demonstrations. Perhaps one of the most famous of these came in Kent State in 1970, where a shooting where national troops opened fire and 5 people were killed. The Kent State shooting is one of the biggest smears against Nixon's handling of the counterculture, which he was vividly opposed to throughout his entire presidency. Nixon believed that Nixon, perhaps borrowing from his Cold War roots, believed very strongly that the entire media and society had played a huge part in the denigration of the culture, which had led to the counterculture and had led to the problems of the earlier 1960s. Nixon believed that there were figures throughout the government, throughout media, throughout television and movies, throughout the entire country who had basically worked to undermine American values, Americanism, patriotism, and a commitment to winning the war in Vietnam. This was where Nixon came up with his enemies list. By the way, something real fast, we're going to talk about celebrities in a second, but one celebrity that changed his mind by 1968 was Frank Sinatra, who had originally helped Kennedy in a huge way win the 1960 election, actually voted for Nixon in 1968 and would be a Republican for the rest of his life. There's a quick, interesting aside. Nixon himself had a group of people that he was committed to, he saw as people who would undermine the fabric of the nation, would do everything in their power to ruin his plans and thwart America's return to peace and prosperity, which was a huge commitment of Nixon's presidential campaign. Appealing to the silent majority who had felt that they had been left behind, Nixon believed that his job was to speak for the moderate and right-wing people who had been quiet throughout much of the 1960s, but horrified at what had been going on with the younger generation, with the war in Vietnam, with the mishandling of the government, with the social and racial tensions that had led to chaos, and with the unfolding chaos in American streets and cities, which had led to rises in crime and other issues as well. Also, the economic prosperity of the 1960s earlier in the decade, seemed to be dying off. And so Nixon needed to make a change there as well. Nixon would make several economic concessions and changes during his presidency that would be extremely crucial for the development of the American economy in the late 20th century in order to quell some of the economic issues and woes that started in the late 1960s as the prosperity of the Johnson and Kennedy years seemed to die off. None of this was Nixon's fault, but Nixon's handling of it had mixed results. That's him on the economic front. Nixon's handling of the domestic unrest, social chaos, and tensions had led to also mixed results. Whereas you had the Kent State shooting with 5 people dead, you also, of course, had a crackdown on crime, rioters, and college campuses becoming less and less noisome throughout the early 1970s. The Kent State continues to be a huge stain on Nixon's legacy of handling these crises, as 5 students dying seemed to be a horrible trade-off for law and order. Nixon also at this time developed what he called his enemies list, who he believed were influential individuals throughout the country who were doing everything in their power, both in politics and in media, socially and politically, culturally, to undermine his presidency and undermine what he wanted to do. A good example of this was the actor Paul Newman, a Democrat who had actively campaigned against him in the 1968 election. Paul Newman called it one of the greatest honors he'd ever received to be one of Nixon's enemies. So, again, this is 3 years before the Watergate scandal, and we're already seeing shades of Nixon's paranoia and fear. Nixon's development of an enemies list sounds very, very similar to what he did while working in Congress as a young Republican. Working alongside figures such as Joseph McCarthy, Nixon had developed a stolid fear and a stolid condemnation of communism, and a fear that communism was running ramshot throughout the American public life in small sectors and cells that were quietly doing everything they could to subvert American values and history. Nixon now believed that it was his job to, once again, perhaps blacklist people who were doing everything in their power to undermine what he believed was best. This is how Nixon had operated his entire political career. In many ways, Watergate is not a surprise. People should not see Watergate as a surprise. They should understand that this is how Nixon believed, that if you had Nixon's purview of how the world worked around you, you would probably eventually come to these kinds of conclusions. If you believe that there were large forces working against you in every sector of life, you would want to do everything in your power to undermine them as much as possible. You would understand, if you looked at the world in such a black and white way as communist bad and capitalist good, you would also probably come to the conclusion that enemies of your opponents to your political agenda bad and supporters good. So Nixon's enemy list actually falls lock, stock, and barrel with his Cold Warrior status. Now, Nixon had been an extremely successful Cold Warrior, and once again, by labeling his enemies, he was also calling out his friends, making it very clear that there was a cultural divide between the younger generation and the older generation, between liberals and conservatives. Nixon also struggled immensely with the media, and we continue to hate the media perhaps more than any other president, which is saying quite something. Richard Nixon's presidency is the beginning, in many ways, of the media showing a left-leaning hand when it comes to handling a president. Nixon, Ford, and every Republican president since then has had to deal overwhelmingly with a media that seems to be democratically leaning. Reagan, Trump, Bush, both Bushes have seemingly been dealing with mainstream media that is implicitly left-leaning and other media outlets that are explicitly left-leaning. This is also to deal with Hollywood and academia, which also are overwhelmingly liberal. Now, this isn't to create sympathy for them. Nixon may have been his own worst enemy here, often insulting members of the media, believing that they were low IQ individuals and basically scavengers and vultures. To be fair to the Democrats, Nixon is not the first president or the first Republican to ever elucidate such views. Harry Truman hated the press and constantly sparred with a reporter from the Washington Post who lambasted his daughter's singing career. Dwight Eisenhower hated giving television addresses because lights would shine on his head and reflect because he was balding. So, presidents have had issues with media for as long as media had existed. Smart and wise presidents have been able to curtail the media's efforts to gotcha questions. But Richard Nixon was not such a man. Nixon was not charismatic. He was not able to spin a narrative. He didn't carry the charism or the approachability of an Obama, Reagan, or Kennedy-like figure. Much more so, Nixon was a shrewd communicator who worked in the shadows, which actually, again, fits the narrative. Once you understand exactly where Richard Nixon came from, exactly how Richard Nixon thought, and exactly why Richard Nixon came to these perspectives, with a basic attitude that everyone was one way or another out to get him from many, many different corridors and secret crannies throughout the government, throughout society, then you can come to the understanding that really, at the end of the day, Nixon was doing what he thought was best, only because out of a desire for survival, not necessarily a huge power grab. Now, at the end of the day, it ended up being a huge power grab, but Nixon perhaps did not initially think this. He believed it was a matter of his own political survival and the survival of his agenda to do what he did. I am not justifying Richard Nixon's actions, nor am I necessarily condemning them. Nixon has had a horrible reputation for the last 55 years. It's not my job to pile that on. People can believe whatever they want about Richard Nixon for whatever reason. In recent years, his legacy seems to be kind of revived a little bit. Many people believe that the deep state, many people, especially on the right these days, who believe very much so that Donald Trump has been a victim and target of the deep state, make comparisons between 47 and 37, believing very firmly that Richard Nixon was as much a target of political hijacking, sabotage, and manipulation as Trump was. And that basically both men were good presidents who got a bad reputation because of the media and other institutes that did everything in their power to destroy them. Many people on the right basically believe that Richard Nixon did nothing wrong with Watergate, and that basically the deep state was targeting him as far as 50 years back. This is a rehabilitation and revisionism from Republicans and right-wingers, not all of them, but some, in an effort to do what they can to make Richard Nixon as good of a president as possible. And this is something that must be objectively looked at. Nixon's track record as a president is actually one of that was quite successful. Nixon's 5 years in the Oval Office, other than the Watergate scandal and other issues, and of course I mentioned Kent State already, proved to be relatively prosperous for the United States. The economy did slow down, and Nixon didn't do the best job of handling it, but the economy was continuing its bumper crop in the 50s and the 60s and really wouldn't start to struggle until the middle of the decade. Nixon also would target ending the Vietnam War, which would probably be his greatest accomplishment. Nixon was a foreign policy genius. He was one of the smartest men to ever occupy the Oval Office, and that's no mean feat. Nixon was also able, through his presidential guile, to work with both Democrats and Republicans to do what he thought was best for the nation in general. Nixon created a basic system of affirmative action, whereby African Americans were given preference and opportunities and other minorities to attend colleges and universities to right decades of social wrongs and discrimination that had kept them from achieving at the highest level. Nixon created affirmative action. Also horrified by the pollution in the Ohio River in 1971, Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, a huge step forward in environmental conservation and an acknowledgement from a Republican president of the dangers of climate change. Nixon also expanded access to Medicare and Social Security during his presidency. Again, none of these things are overtly right-wing and do not smell of a Cold Warrior at all. But perhaps more than anything, they give the impression of a logical and thoughtful man who knew very well how to politically succeed, which is something that obviously Nixon did his absolute best when he was president. Nixon knew how to compromise. He knew how to work with other people, believe it or not. Now, that didn't mean that Nixon was likable by any stretch of the imagination. Again, Nixon developed a cult of hatred. Not a cult of personality, but in many ways the opposite, whereby it was very easy to hate Richard Nixon. Who do you think is more attractive? Who do you think is more likable? Who do you think is more personable? The stingy, grumpy, kind of dumpy president, or Paul Newman, the beautiful, handsome actor who has an Oscar, or at least Oscar nominations under his belt, and beautiful blue eyes? Who's going to be more appealing to you? Who's more going to speak to you? Nixon represented a status quo that was intransigent and intrepid. Nixon was successful. He was thoughtful. He was politically scheming, but he wasn't at the same time likable in many facets, and continued to struggle with disapproval throughout much of his presidency. However, this did not keep him from doing a bad job. Just because somebody is not a likable person or doesn't seem to be the most telegenic or charismatic president doesn't mean they cannot succeed. And perhaps the answer to John F. Kennedy and his likability that sometimes clashed with his inexperience, such as with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nixon's experience and reasonability and wisdom clashed oftentimes with his unlikability and his inability to compromise on several key issues. However, Nixon did prove that he wasn't as stalwart in his convictions as some had thought. In fact, it was perfectly necessary for him to do what he could to get his agenda across and succeed, even if it meant betraying old right-wing values of his. This isn't to say that Nixon wasn't a right-winger anymore. Nixon simply had a more moderate approach to Republican and conservative politics that would continue to define him throughout his presidency. Nixon would do many turns that would surprise a lot of people. One of the biggest ones of these, and some of the biggest ones of these, came with foreign policy. Nixon was determined to end the Vietnam War. However, Nixon believed that he needed to end the war with dignity and with grace. He believed that the United States could indeed accomplish some of its goals and created a whole new policy approaching to the war called Vietnamization. Rather than doubling down on continual involvement in the war, Nixon acknowledged the need for the war to come to a sturdy and soon end. At the same time, however, Nixon refused to end the war outright. Rather, Nixon's approach was that the United States, through the process of properly democratizing and stabilizing the government and society of South Vietnam, could create a country that could stand on its own. Today, we call this nation building. Nixon believed that it was imperative that the South Vietnamese domino not fall. He believed strongly in the domino theory, that if one of these nations became communist, they would all become communist. Yet Nixon at the same time also realized that the war did not seem winnable and would only further antagonize the Soviet Union and China. China had just become nuclear, by the way, and that seemed like a bad thing to do. Nixon was also wary of continual tensions and bad relations with Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet premier, who was pretty stalwart in his communist convictions. So Nixon knew very well that the war had gone on too long. That victory wasn't necessarily an inevitability. However, Nixon also realized that the victory that the Americans wanted wasn't the reunification of North and South Vietnam under a democratic government, but was that the South Vietnamese would be left alone by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would lay down its weapons or be destroyed. Therefore, Nixon started the process known as Vietnamization, which would basically enable the South Vietnamese to stand on their own 2 feet with the help of the United States and take control of the fighting and of their own government. In order to do this, Nixon believed it was his job to disable the power and the strength of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. believing that tunnels and supply lines stretched all throughout not just North Vietnam but Cambodia and Laos, and was how covert military guerrilla operations, supplies, and rations had been reaching the South Vietnamese fighters who had done everything they could to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and defeat the American forces. Nixon expanded the war during the first couple of years of his presidency and began sending napalm and other bombing squads into certain regions of North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, expanding U.S. military operations and attacking several other countries in an attempt to destroy the supply chain of the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. This was seen as an overly aggressive action by many. However, Nixon was slowly but surely working towards an end. By continuing to intimidate the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, Nixon believed this put him in a better position to negotiate a possible end to the war that would get South Vietnam on its feet. And believe it or not, although history showed this to be poorly inaccurate and completely untrue, Nixon did achieve this through the help of his first national security advisor, who later became the Secretary of State, perhaps one of the most famous diplomats in all of world history, Harry Kissinger. Is it Henry or Harry? Harry Kissinger. Henry? Henry sounds better, but Harry Kissinger. Kissinger eventually negotiated the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, and Paris, once again, was the site of a major peace accord, which has happened so many times, by the way. Can't tell you how many times that has happened in history. Henry Kissinger, sorry. So Henry Kissinger, who'd been Nixon's national security advisor, would soon become his Secretary of State and soon serve under Gerald Ford in that same capacity because of his success in negotiations with the North Vietnamese with the Paris Accords of 1973, or 1972, 1973. And basically, this was the agreement that it came down to. The United States would leave all military operations to the South Vietnamese government in exchange for the South Vietnamese government being allowed to retain its independence from the North Vietnamese. Basically, the United States had achieved its goal of keeping South Vietnam from the communist clutches. The domino theory would continue, but Nixon had achieved a stoppage and prevented the North Vietnamese from going into the South. So, what else was I going to say? Nixon had achieved a huge diplomatic victory. However, things would only continue to become more complex. He hadn't freed North Vietnam from the communist clutches, nor had he prevented communism from spreading to Laos and Cambodia, which it would later in the decade, mainly because of the destabilization of the governments in those regions, which was not helped at all by Nixon's bombing campaigns. The complex truth of the matter is that 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords went into effect and the United States left South Vietnam, and only a year after Nixon resigned, Saigon fell, became Ho Chi Minh City, and North Vietnam unified the country under one communist government, which continues 50 years later. Now, if Richard Nixon had been president, it's very possible that that would not have happened, that the United States actually would have been able to help the South Vietnamese, perhaps by continued military involvement. Gerald Ford seemed much less likely to get involved in any of this due to the American wariness over the war and political complications because he pardoned Richard Nixon for the Watergate scandal. But imagine that the Watergate scandal didn't happen or didn't become the massive canard in Nixon's legacy that it has become in many ways rightfully. Nixon might have been able to prevent South Vietnam from going into the communist camp. The North may not have attacked South Vietnam. Saigon may never have fallen. Now, of course, hypotheticals, counterfactuals, what-ifs in history are usually a bad way to go down because you don't really know how that's actually going to work. But Nixon had the strategic timing and the wisdom to know when to end a war. He did something that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had all failed to do: bring about a peaceful, semi-peaceful resolution to the Vietnam conflict. Of course, this wouldn't last, but that's not necessarily Nixon's fault either. So, what's up next? Well, Nixon also had other political plans for other parts of the Cold War. Nixon had noticed throughout the 1960s that the Soviet Union and Communist China, who had once been very close with Mao and Joseph Stalin, were now drifting apart. Mao had a particular animus for Nikita Khrushchev, and even after Khrushchev was gone and Brezhnev became the main leader of the Communist Party in 1964 and 1965, Mao really didn't care anymore for the communists of Russia, who he believed were sellouts. Mao was much more committed to expand, as were the communists in China, to expanding their influence. This included the seizing of Tibet and other things. And with the Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s starting to unfold, suffering and death once again plagued China in massive numbers as Mao's death toll continued to rise into the tens of millions by the time Nixon was back in office. Nixon downplayed these events, which seems kind of shocking for a Cold Warrior to do, but once again, perhaps this was political concession and compromise based on a strategic end for Nixon. Nixon believed that creating the EPA, providing better Social Security opportunities, and affirmative action would right previous wrongs, make it easier for the American people, and make his presidency more successful. Maybe underneath all of it is a man who simply was so tired of being hated that he did things to be liked. Or perhaps there was more politicking involved than we like to think. Perhaps Nixon was simply doing what he thought was the best thing to do strategically in order to open up new canals and opportunities, both domestically and in foreign policy. This comes to Nixon's probably biggest moment on the foreign policy stage. A gamble that is still being evaluated by historians, and many, even now in the modern Republican Party, may seem as retroactively a mistake, but was seen at the time as one of the biggest and most consequential changes in modern world history. Nixon decided to take advantage of the growing rift between the Chinese and the Soviets. Several years before, there had been border disputes in which several soldiers on both sides had been killed, and both sides had gone close to war. The Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s would be capitalized on by Nixon, who believed that the best thing possible was to take down the tensions of the Cold War and put the Soviet Union in a corner. In order to do this, he needed to take away the most populous nation on earth from the Soviet clutches. Allowing the Eastern Bloc to remain under communism was something that U.S. presidents had taken for granted. Johnson had done nothing to stop Czechoslovakia and Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring of 1968, and Eisenhower, with Nixon as his vice president, had done precious little to aid the Hungarian revolutionaries of 1956 who were crushed by Soviet tanks. However, Nixon, in an interesting about-face, decided that he would take advantage of this split through diplomacy, not through military action. Nixon would do something unprecedented. He would become the first U.S. president to visit China. This is what many people call the opening of China. Now, China had been open to Western influences before in many different ways, particularly at the hands of the British Empire in the 19th century. However, this was a huge step forward in relations between the Soviet Union, between China and the United States, and would also be a way for the United States to continue to improve their relations with the Soviet Union. Nixon decided to kill two birds with one stone. In 1972, he visited China and met with Mao, as well as other leaders of the Communist Party, with Mao being quite old and decrepit. Nixon actually praised the efforts of Mao Zedong and walked on the Great Wall of China. All of a sudden, a head of a Western country thought it was noteworthy to visit the People's Republic of China, to recognize and affirm the communist government and compliment its leader, who had an extremely mixed reputation at the time in Mao Zedong. Nixon and his wife, Patricia, by the way, on the Great Wall of China. The summer visit of 1972 is considered one of the most consequential in American history. This is called the opening of China. But really what it was is it's the division of China. It was affirming and complimenting Mao in a way that would turn him more and more against the Soviets. Nixon didn't do this because he was a nice person or because he actually liked Mao or enjoyed communism. Nixon had not become a closeted communist. His years of working against communism had made him hate them all the more. But Nixon understood that peace, prosperity, and political security was far more important than necessarily getting what he wanted all the time. Nixon, through his political shrewdness, had become an expert compromiser and realized that in order to get the Soviet Union to the table, he had to butter up the Chinese. The normalizations of relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China would lead to an economic partnership that has become perhaps the most famous in the entire world. It would lead to huge amounts of prosperity and success for both countries over the next 50 years, and Nixon would become the poster child for democratizing China, opening them up to the idea of maybe abandoning some of their more hardline communist ideas for the potential to work with American trade and in commercial interests, allowing them to become more capitalistic as the decades went on. Perhaps Nixon was working in a subtle way to undermine communism itself in China and to show that the West would make the first step towards peace, prosperity, and freedom. However, Nixon did this by turning a blind eye to the suffering of millions of Chinese people. So there is definitely a controversial aspect to look at this by. However, once again, political strategy, whether it be the covert way that it tacitly undermined and attacked communism as an ideology, or the more obvious way in which it sought to separate the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese even more, were Nixon's ultimate goals. And Nixon achieved these ultimate goals in pretty Nixon-esque fashion. Nothing too flashy, nothing attractive, and nothing very likable or telegenic, but something subtly quite brilliant and successful. The Communist Chinese became open to the United States. The normalization of relations put fear into the hearts of Brezhnev and the other Soviets. Basically, Richard Nixon had achieved something that no other president had done. Not only had he ventured to East Asia and opened up a series of relations with them, but he had also taken one communist country out of the geopolitical fight. This would lead to a huge change in Chinese and American relations, like I already said, but it would also lead to a change in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union becoming interested in Nixon's next policy, Détente. Basically, the underlying theory from Nixon throughout the night and others during the 1960s and 70s was tensions had gotten high enough during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The simmering down of tensions and the thawing of tensions in which both sides would become more open to communication and cooperation, especially to reducing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, would become a key part of Nixon's foreign policy. This would lead eventually to the first SALT Treaty, which Nixon would come up with and eventually be ratified by his vice president, Gerald Ford, when he became president. But Nixon basically was able to actually visit the Soviet Union, meet with Leonid Brezhnev, and start a series of normalization with them as well that would include the reduction of nuclear weapons. A man who had been so adept at fighting against Cold warriors now braved the cold to meet with two of the most brutal communist dictators in the world at the time and do everything in his power to bring about more normalized, peaceful relations with both of them. A fascinating turn of events. Had Nixon become soft in his old age? Probably not. Had Nixon become a communist in the closet? Certainly not. Did Nixon hate communism as much as he did in the 1940s and 50s? Probably. But had Nixon become, through the years and the decades of political manipulation, subterfuge, and all of the struggles he had to get from the White House in the 50s back to the White House in the late 1960s, a shrewd political navigator who wanted to get his things done? Probably. Nixon's show and actions with Vietnam, with China, and with the Soviet Union do not show a hardline anti-communist stance that he perhaps had when he was younger, but shows a willingness to tacitly undermine their institutions while also seeking world peace and a better outcome for the United States. Nixon is an interestingly subtle America First type president. Now, this isn't necessarily a Donald Trump for America First, but Nixon basically had this approach in foreign policy that the United States work their own peace and prosperity, and that is generally how you want international relations to work in your favor. Things should go your way and should work for you and be better for you than for everyone else, and if you are getting the short, well, that's not good enough. And perhaps Nixon had achieved negotiations. Again, you see Nixon's capability of being an excellent diplomat, but you also see Nixon's subtlety and his ability to manipulate the situation, something that would happen, obviously, with the Watergate scandal. Well, what happens next? Nixon goes into 1972 and the election having achieved a decent amount. That isn't to say that it's all peaches and sunshine. Nixon's economic decisions ended up mixed results. The price controls that he put in during his presidency later had taking a controversial presidential comes to economics. And of course, many people continue to criticize the EPA, the expansion of Medicare and Social Security, and the building of a government leviathan. Nixon also put in price controls, like I mentioned before, and basically knew very well that they would have. Nixon had an election to win. Extraordinarily politically savvy, but he was also just very often. So